All right, it's been a minute. I was like super vigilant and consistent for like 3 weeks. And then I didn't read for a couple of days. Was busy, tired, baby not sleeping, exhausted. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's just like you do something really consistently and then you don't do it once or twice and then you just completely fall off and it becomes like a thing to get back into it. Especially a difficult thing. So we were on I was on nobody listens to this, the third analogy. Actually, I've gotten some really nice comments from people that have been encouraging, even though, I've noted I'm only on page 227 after all this time and energy. But yeah, I've learned a lot. It's been really awesome so far. I don't know if I've learned a lot, but I've experienced a lot. And so we're on the third analogy. And this is where Kant is trying to, weave in time to his theory. The first analogy dealt with how we can understand things to be consistent over time, which was through substance. The second thing was how we can understand causation, which is things occur consecutively within time. These are obviously vast oversimplifications. My understanding is the third analogy is going to discuss how things exist simultaneously at a certain time. And yeah, so let's just get into it. C, third analogy, principle of simultaneity, accordance to the law of interaction or community. Okay. All substances, insofar as they can be perceived as simultaneous in space, are in thoroughgoing interaction. Okay, so everything that can be perceived in space is interacting with everything else. Proof: things are simultaneous when, in empirical intuition, the perceptions can follow upon one another reciprocally, which, as was shown in the second principle, cannot occur in the temporal succession of appearances. Okay, things are simultaneous when, in empirical intuition, the perceptions can follow upon one another reciprocally. Does that just mean like at the same time? Which, as was shown in the second principle, cannot occur in the temporal succession of appearances. Okay, thus I can observe first the moon and afterwards the earth, or conversely, first the earth and afterwards the moon. This is kind of like the subjective. I think the example was the house. I can perceive, door, window consecutively, or window, door, doesn't matter. But the acorn falling out of the tree, there has to be an order to that. And it's therefore objective through necessity. Okay. And because the perceptions of these objects can follow one another reciprocally, I say that the objects are simultaneous. Okay. Now, simultaneity is the existence of the manifold in the same time. Time itself, however, cannot be perceived, so that we might learn from the fact that things are placed in the same time that their perceptions can follow one another reciprocally. The synthesis of imagination and apprehension, therefore, would give us each of these perceptions as present in the subject when the other is absent, and vice versa. It would never tell us that the objects are simultaneous, That is, that if the one is there, the other is also there at the same time, and this by necessity, so the perceptions may follow one another reciprocally. Hence we require a concept of the understanding of the reciprocal sequence of determinations of things existing at the time, but outside one another, in order to be able to say that the reciprocal sequence of perceptions is founded in the object, and thus to represent their simultaneity as objective. Okay. I'm going to reread that. Hence we require a concept of the understanding of the reciprocal sequence of determinations of things existing at the same time, but outside one another, in order to be able to say that the reciprocal sequence of the perceptions is found in the object, and thus to represent their simultaneity as objective. The relation of substances, however, of which the first has determinations, the ground of which is contained in the other, is the relation of influence. And if the latter reciprocally contains the ground of the determinations in the former, then the relation is that of community or interaction. So effectively, if the objects can affect one another reciprocally, they must exist in the same time. What a fucked up, confusing way of saying that, if that's what he's trying to say, but like, okay. My anxiety is like through the roof right now. I'm just like, can I do this right now? Hence, the simultaneity of substances in space cannot be known in experience, save under the presupposition of interaction among them. Okay. And this is therefore also the condition of the possibility of the things themselves as objects of experience. Things are simultaneous insofar as they exist at one and the same time. But how can we know that they exist at one and the same time? Only if the order in the synthesis of apprehension of this manifold is indifferent. That is, if I may advance from A through B, C, D to E, or contrawise from E to A. Meaning if you have the ability to synthesize things in any order, you could start with any of them and therefore they all exist at the same time. Okay. For if the synthesis were successive in time, in the order beginning with A and ending with E, it would be impossible to begin the apprehension with the perception of E and go backwards to A. Again, this is the house versus the apple or whatever we talked about falling out of the tree. Because A belongs to past time, and therefore can therefore no longer be an object of apprehension. If we suppose it possible that in a number of substances, as appearances, each were perfectly isolated, so that none influenced another, or received influences from another, then their simultaneity could not be an object of possible perception, nor could the existence of one by any process of empirical synthesis lead us to the existence of another. I gotta read that again, I'm sorry. If we supposed it possible that in a number of substances, as appearances, each were perfectly isolated, so that none influenced another or received influences from another, then their simultaneity could not be an object of possible perception, nor could the existence of the one by any process of empirical synthesis lead us on to the existence of another. Okay, if things were truly isolated, like, we wouldn't be able to perceive them at the same time. For if we imagine that the substances could be separated by a perfectly empty space, then the perception proceeding in time from one to the other would no doubt determine the existence of this other substance by means of a subsequent perception, but would never be able to distinguish whether that appearance followed objectively upon the first or was simultaneous with it. Okay. We must therefore be something besides their mere existence. Oh my God, did I say we? There must therefore be something besides the mere existence by which A determines for B its position in time, and B for A, because only thus can these two substances be represented empirically as existing simultaneously. Nothing, however, determines the position of anything else in time except that which is the cause or which is its cause or the cause of its determinations. Therefore, every substance, since it can be an effect only with regard to its determinations, must contain within itself the causality of certain determinations in the other substance, and at the same time the effects of the causality of that other substance. That is, the substances must stand immediately or mediately in dynamical community, if their simultaneity is to be known in any possible experience. And I think the way that I've conceptualized this when I was watching the lecture related to this is like the example in the previous section, the second example, where it's like if something existed, like were introduced to the timeline effectively. Like if something didn't exist in the timeline, it would have to be introduced at some point, and therefore would have had to exist somewhere outside of the timeline. So it doesn't really make sense. It's like kind of an impossibility, unless there was another timeline, which there isn't. We don't think. But even if it was, like, when would they meet in order to communicate? String theory. I don't know. And so I think this kind of makes sense. Like if things are not constantly, even potentially, like he says, like have the ability to, and the potential causality that would happen if they did interact, like what would be the thing introducing them if it wasn't always there, if they weren't always within the same space with the ability to interact and interacting in some sense. Okay. So now with regard to the objects of experience, anything without which the experience of these objects would itself be impossible is necessary. Okay. Again, oh man, probably the most confusing way to say it, but okay. Hence, it is necessary for all substances in the appearance, insofar as they are simultaneous, to stand in thoroughgoing community of interaction with one another. The word community can be used in two senses, meaning either communio or commercium. Okay. We use it here in the latter sense, commercium, as a dynamical community without which even the local community, communia spatii, could never be known empirically. Okay, we can easily perceive in our experience that only continuous influences in all positions in space can lead our senses from one object to another. Yes? That the light which plays between our eyes and the celestial bodies produce immediate community between us and them, and so proves their simultaneity. Beautiful. That we cannot empirically alter any places and perceive such an alteration unless matter itself renders the perception of our own position possible, and that only by means of its reciprocal influence can matter establish its simultaneity, and thus, though only mediately, the coexistence of objects even down to the most distant ones. Without this community, every perception of appearance in space would be separated from the others, and the chain of empirical representations, that is, experience, would have to begin anew with every new object, without the previous experience being in the least connected with it or standing to it in relation of time. I think his point's fairly well taken. If it were true that they were at any point not connected, everything would have to be disconnected, and then kind of start. If you were able to move from one thing to another, we certainly perceive certain things as simultaneous, right? Like if they're, let's say, in our field of experience, but they wouldn't be in this sense if they weren't able to interact, and we would essentially be, I don't know, it would create a very weird situation where each perception would kind of be this new experience by itself if the things weren't connected in simultaneity, if that makes sense. It makes sense in my head. I don't know if I'm explaining it very well. That is, experience would have to begin anew with every object, without the previous experience being in the least connected with it or standing to it in a relation of time. I do not want to say anything here to disprove empty space. Empty space may exist wherever perception cannot reach, and hence where there is no empirical knowledge of simultaneity. But in that case, space is no object for any possible experience. The following remarks may elucidate this. In our mind, all appearances, as being contained in a possible experience, must share a community of apperception. Makes sense. And insofar as the objects are to be represented as connected in simultaneous existence, they must reciprocally determine their position in one time, and thereby constitute a whole. If this subjective community... So hold on, let me highlight. I've been highlighting too much stuff. It's not that helpful when you highlight everything, but I wanted to highlight that too. If this subjective community is to rest on an objective ground, or is to refer to appearances as substances, then a perception of one as ground must render possible the perception of the other, and vice versa, so that the succession which always exists in perceptions as apprehensions may not be attributed to the objects, but the objects should be represented as existing simultaneously. This is a reciprocal influence, that is, a real community of substances, without which the empirical relation of simultaneity would not occur in experience. Okay. Through this commercium, appearances, as being apart from each other and yet connected, constitute a composite, and such composites become possible in many ways. The three dynamical relations, therefore, from which all others arise are inherence, consequence, and composition. Interesting. Okay. And that's the end of the third analogy. And then there's some summary remarks here, I think. These are the three analogies of experience. They are nothing but principles for determining the existence of appearances in time, according to all its three modes, namely, the relation to time itself as a magnitude of existence, that is, duration, the relation of time as in a series, successively, and finally, also the relation of time as a sum total of all existence, that is, as simultaneous. This unity in the determination of time is altogether dynamical. That is, time is not looked upon as that in which experience immediately determines, for every existence, its position. For this would be impossible, because absolute time is not an object of perception by which appearances could be held together. Rather, a rule of the understanding, through which alone the existence of appearances can receive synthetic unity in relations of time, determines for each of them its position in time, and therefore does so a priori and as valid for all and every time. They fucking lost me. I knew it. I was like reading it and I'm like, I'm not 100%. Okay, whatever. I'm going to go back to after he just explained the three analogies. Okay. This unity in the determination of time is altogether dynamical. That is, time is not looked upon as that in which experience immediately determines, for every existence, its position. Right? For this would be impossible, because absolute time is not an object of perception by which appearances could be held together. Right? Rather, the rule of the understanding, through which alone the existence of appearances can receive synthetic unity in relations of time, determines for each of them its position in time. So the understanding through the synthetic unity in relations of time determines the position of things in time, and therefore does so a priori and as valid for all and every time. That's where I was really lost. Why does it do it a priori? Because it comes from the understanding. And I suppose that the position would be everything has to exist with duration, successively, and simultaneously to a certain extent. Like, we know those things are going to apply before we actually experience them. But, like, since we don't experience time in kind of an objective way, it's what he's talking about last sentence, we can't necessarily place things in time based on these rules. I think. Okay. But by nature, in the empirical sense of the word, we mean the coherence of appearances in their existence according to necessary rules, that is, according to laws. There are certain laws, and they are a priori, which make nature possible in the first place. Empirical laws can exist and be discovered only through experience, and indeed, in consequence of those original laws, through which experience itself becomes possible in the first place. Our analogies, therefore, present the unity of nature, in coherence of all appearances under certain exponents, which express nothing but the relation of time, insofar as time comprehends all existence, to the unity of apperception, a unity that can only occur in synthesis according to rules. Together, therefore, the analogies simply say that all appearances lie and must lie in one nature. For without such a priori unity, no unity of experience, and therefore no determination of objects in experience, would be possible. I should have just played a video game. I was painting my bike, and it's going so badly. Don't try to spray paint a bike. It fucking sucks. And it's gonna look terrible. It's one of those things where, like, you watch somebody do it on YouTube, and you're like, oh man, shit's easy. My bike's gonna look dope. Can't wait. And then you do it, and you're like, the situation. I'm not gonna get in. I'll get into it when I'm playing like a video game or something. But I'm pissed off about it. I'm so annoyed. It looks terrible. It's like depressing the whole experience. Like, mostly, like, I don't know. That was the big upshot, right? Like, that was the big upgrade. The paint will look better. There's obviously a lot of other stuff I'm doing. I'm like building it from scratch pretty much from the frame. But anyway, if the paint looks like garbage, like it doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. I mean, how it rides, obviously, but apart from that, like, whatever. Fuck it. Who cares? Okay. So that's kind of the mindset I'm in when I'm like struggling through this shit. Just a little background. With regard to the mode of proof by which we have arrived at these transcendental laws of nature, and with regard to its peculiar character, a remark must be made which will become important as a rule for any other attempt to prove a priori propositions that are intellectual and at the same time synthetic. Okay? Seems important. All our labor would have been in vain if we had attempted to prove these analogies dogmatically, that is, from concepts, to prove, namely, that all that exists is found only in that which is permanent. To prove that all that exists is found only when that... Okay. That every event presupposes something in a previous state upon which it follows by rule. And lastly, that in simultaneous manifold, the states in relation to one another are simultaneous according to a rule, stand in community. Okay, what he's saying is, like, we couldn't have proved these as, like... he's not exactly saying an empirical, but these things don't have to be true, I think is what he's saying. And we can't just prove them because, you know, that's how we experience things. There has to be, like, something more, I think. For we may analyze concepts as much as we like. By means of the mere concepts of things, we shall never get from one object, and its existence to the existence of another, or its mode of existence. What else then remained? There remained the possibility of experience, as a knowledge in which all objects must, in the end, be capable of being given to us, if their representation is to have objective reality for us. In this third, the essential form of which consists in the synthetic unity of apperception of all appearances, we discovered the a priori conditions of a thoroughgoing and necessary determination of time of all existence in appearance, without which even the empirical determination of time would be impossible. We thus found rules of the synthetic a priori unity, by means of which we can anticipate experience. It was because people were ignorant. Sorry. It's because people were ignorant of this method and imagined that they could give dogmatic proof of synthetic propositions, which the empirical use of the understanding recommends as its principles, that so many, and always unsuccessful, attempts have been made to prove the principle of sufficient reason. Right, and we can't use, like, empirical experience, because empirical experience doesn't, like, necessarily have to be true. Ever. See David Hume. The other two analogies have not even been thought of, though everybody followed them unconsciously. Footnote alert. Oh no. The unity of the cosmic whole, with a W, in which all appearances are to be connected, is evidently a mere consequence of the quietly adopted principle of the community of all substances that are simultaneous. For if they were isolated, they would not, as parts, form a whole, and if their connection, the interaction of the manifold, were not already necessary by virtue of their simultaneity, it would be impossible to use the latter, which is merely ideal relation, to infer the former, which is real relation. We have shown, however, that community is really the ground of the possibility of an empirical knowledge of coexistence, and that actually we can only infer back to that community from this empirical knowledge as its condition. Okay. I'm not gonna. Okay. Fine. I'm sure that's right. You got it, Kant. Back to the body text. For what was lacking was the guiding thread of categories, by which alone any gap in the understanding, both with regard to concepts and principles, can be discovered and pointed out. Categories? What the fuck are you talking about? Okay. The next section is the postulates of empirical thought in general. I'm a little confused by the breakup of these sections, because the refutation of idealism is right after this. So is that... Hold on. So is that part of the postulates of empirical thought in general? It wouldn't seem to fall under empirical thought, like refutation of idealism. Well, I guess it would be, because it's refuting idealism. Oh. I'm just going to read this section. I don't know. Let's see how it goes. Well, what's the worst that can happen? I could throw the microphone, probably. Okay. Section 4, just as 4. The postulates of empirical thought in general. 1. I think this is like a proof situation. That which agrees to the formal conditions of experience in intuition and in concepts is possible. Okay. 2. That which is connected with the material conditions of experience is actual. Okay. So essentially 1 is like that which follows the rules of experience is possible. Like, doesn't contradict with them. 2, if something is actually connected with the material conditions, it's actually there. It's actually whatever, actual. Okay, 3. That the connection of which with the actual is determined in accordance with the universal conditions of experience is necessary. Okay, that which connection of which with the actual. Like, why is that necessary? That the connection of which with the actual is determined. Is this like a translation? Like, come on, man. That's nobody would write a sentence like that. Okay. That the connection of which with the actual is determined in accordance with universal conditions of experience is necessary. Right, if something is universal, it's always true, and therefore it must be, the case. So it's necessary. We kind of talked about this stuff. Okay. Explanation, please. The categories of modality have the peculiarity that in determining an object, they do not in the least expand the concept to which they are attached as predicates. They only express the relation of the object to our faculty of knowledge. Even when the concept of a thing is quite complete, I can still ask with reference to this object whether it is merely possible or also actual, and if actual, whether it is also necessary. You could ask that. People make fun of you. No new determinations are thereby thought in the object itself. The question is only how the object, with all its determinations, relates to the understanding and its empirical use, to the empirical power of judgment and to reason. Right. So if you have something like in front of you and you're perceiving it and like, okay, you can ask whether it's possible, which probably is if it's sitting there. You can ask whether it's actual, which it is because it's sitting there. You can also ask if it's necessary. But these are all functions of the understanding. The thing is just fucking there, as an appearance probably. We certainly don't know it as a thing in itself, Kant has established, but these are all things that exist in our reason. They can be rules that we apply to the world to understand it, but Like, it doesn't exist in that thing as some sort of, determination that can be extracted from it, if that makes sense. Even the possibility or the actual is like applying rules to figure out like what our perception of it is. Okay. The principles of modality are, precisely therefore, nothing but explanations of the concepts of possibility, actuality, and necessity in their empirical use. At the same time, they restrict all categories to their merely empirical use, and do not admit or allow their transcendental use. I need some coffee. For if these categories... Oh, I think I do have some. For if these categories are not to have a merely logical significance, expressing analytically the form of thought, but are to refer to things and their possibility, actuality, or necessity, then they must concern possible experience and its synthetic unity, in which alone objects of knowledge can be given. Right, and if we were to actually figure out what concepts apply to things, all these other things, we would actually have to figure it out based on their knowledge of them through experience, I think is what he's saying. The postulate of the possibility of things demands that their concepts should agree with the formal conditions of an experience in general. This, the objective form of experience in general, contains all the synthesis that is required for a knowledge of objects. Right? Things that are required, okay. A concept is to be considered as empty, and as referring to no object, if the synthesis that it contains does not belong to experience, either as a synthesis derived from it, in which case it is called an empirical concept, or a synthesis on which, as an a priori condition, all experience in general, in its form, rests, in which case it is a pure concept, but a concept yet belonging to experience, because its object can only be found in experience. For whence could we derive the character of the possibility of an object which is thought through a synthetic a priori concept, except from the synthesis which constitutes the form of all empirical knowledge in objects? It is no doubt a necessary logical condition that such a concept must contain no contradiction. Okay? But this is by no means sufficient to establish the objective reality of the concept. Right? That is, the possibility of such an object as is thought through the concept. Right? Just because it isn't a contradiction doesn't mean it's an actual, real concept, I guess. I've been getting hung up on it being the example being a thing here, I think, a little too much. Thus, in the concept of a figure enclosed by two straight lines, there is no contradiction, because the concept of two straight lines and their meeting contain no negation of the figure. The impossibility depends not on the concept itself, but on its construction in space, that is, on the conditions of space and its determinations. And it is these that have objective reality, that is, they apply to possible things, because they contain a priori the form of experience in general. Okay. Think I'm generally there. And now we shall try to explain the manifold usefulness and influence of the postulate of possibility. Okay? If I represent to myself a thing that is permanent, while everything which changes belongs merely to its state, then I can never know from such a concept alone that a thing of that kind is possible. Okay. So if you represent something that's permanent, here are the rules, essentially, I think is what he's saying. So the thing is permanent. And a bunch of things change about it, but that's merely its kind of state. I don't know. Think about like some molecules. Like you could change them around, they'd be water. You could change them around, they'd be gas. I mean, this is scientifically speaking not particularly accurate, but you don't necessarily know if that thing is actually possible based on those rules. The fact that there's something permanent to it, but its state can change. Okay? Or, if I represent to myself something so constituted that when it is posited, something else must at all times inevitably follow upon it. This may no doubt be thought without contradiction. Right, but it doesn't have to be real or true. But we have as yet no means of judging whether such a property, or possible, I guess is what Kant is getting at here, is to be met with any possible thing. Lastly, I can very well represent to myself different things, substances, so constituted that the state of one produces a consequence in the state of the other, and this reciprocally. But whether such a relation can belong to any things cannot be learned from these concepts, which contain a merely arbitrary synthesis. Agreed. The objective reality of these concepts is only known when we see that they express a priori the relations of perception in every experience. Universality. Then we would know they were possible, because they'd be necessary. Right? Is that what he's getting at? And this objective reality, that is their transcendental truth, though known independently of all experience, is nevertheless not known independently of all relation to the form of an experience in general, and to that synthetic unity in which alone objects can be known empirically. Okay. Cool. But if we should think of framing new concepts of substances, forces, and interactions out of material supplied to us by our perceptions, without borrowing from experience the example of their connection, then we should entangle ourselves in mere figments of our mind. This be dialectics. It's this. The possibility of which could not be tested by any criteria. Right. If I imagine like an 8-legged giraffe. This is a cool example. Certainly possible, but there's no a priori rule I could apply to make that necessary, and therefore it exists. Because in forming them, we were not guided by experience, nor had we taken these concepts from it. Such imaginary concepts are cool. I'm just kidding. Such imaginary concepts, as opposed to the categories, cannot receive the character of their possibility a priori, true, as conditions on which all experience depends, but only a posteriori, as concepts given by experience itself. I mean, that would be true of a 4-legged giraffe, right? And so their because okay, you get it. And so their possibility can either not be known at all, or must be known a posteriori and empirically. Okay. Thus, for instance, a substance supposed to be present as permanent in space and yet not filling it, like that intermediate something between matter and thinking beings, which some have tried to introduce, or a special faculty of our mind by which we can intuit, not only infer, the future in advance, or lastly, another faculty by which we can enter into community of thought with other human beings, telekinesis, however distant they may be, cell phone. All these are concepts, the possibility of which has nothing to rest on, because it is not... What's your fucking point, Kant? What the fuck is the point? Because it is not founded on experience and its known laws. Without these, I'm enjoying this because I'm reading this and I'm understanding it. It's not, I don't know why he's saying this. Without these, that possibility is and can only be an arbitrary combination of thoughts which, though it contains nothing contradictory in itself, has no claim to objective reality, or the possibility of such an object as is thought by them. With regard to reality, it seems obvious that we cannot think it in concreto without the aid of experience, for reality only concerns sensation as the matter of experience, and not the form of relation with which we could at most play in fancies. I here pass by everything the possibility of which can only be learned from its actuality in experience, and I mean to consider only the possibility of things through a priori concepts. I mean to consider the possibility... okay. Of these things, I continue to maintain that they can never result from such concepts by themselves, but only when these concepts are viewed as formal and objective conditions of an experience in general. Okay. It might indeed seem... Hold on. I want to reread that paragraph. I here pass by everything, the possibility of which can only be learned from its actuality in experience, and I mean to consider only the possibility of things through a priori concepts. Okay, so Kant is concerned with like what we can actually know about the world, and we've known this for a minute, but a priori is what he's saying, because that's the only real truth, because like all the things that we actually experience don't have to be true unless we can kind of derive them a priori, then they must be true. And that's why he's talking about possibility and then actuality and then necessity. Maybe. Okay. Of these things, I continue to maintain that they can never result from such concepts by themselves, but only when these concepts are viewed as formal and objective conditions of an experience in general. It might indeed seem as if the possibility of a triangle could be known from its concept by itself, being independent of experience. For to the concept we can give an object entirely a priori. That is, we can construct it. Right, so the triangle must exist because I can make one in my mind, and I don't have to experience it. And maybe it doesn't exist for real, but like, doesn't that count as existing, even if I can just make one in my mind? But as this is only the form of an object, it would always only remain a product of the imagination. The possibility of its object would remain doubtful, because more is wanted to establish it, namely that such a figure should be thought under all those conditions on which all objects of experience rest. That which connects with this concept the representation of the possibility of such a thing is solely the fact that space is a formal a priori condition of outer experiences, and that the formative synthesis by which we construct a triangle in imagination is exactly the same as the synthesis which we exercise in the apprehension of an appearance in order to make an empirical concept of it. Okay, what? That which connects with this concept the representation of the possibility of such a thing is solely the fact that space is a formal a priori condition of outer experiences, and that the formative synthesis by which we construct a triangle in the imagination is exactly the same as that synthesis which we exercise in the apprehension of an appearance in order to make an empirical concept of it. Okay? Meaning, effectively the way that we construct a triangle in our head, it would be the same as if we drew it on a piece of paper and actually experienced an appearance of it. So what's the difference? And thus the possibility of I think that's what he's saying. And thus the possibility of continuous magnitudes, nay, of magnitudes in general, the concepts of which are always synthetic, can never be clear from the concepts themselves, but only from these concepts as formal conditions of the determinations of objects in experience in general. And where indeed should we look for objects corresponding to concepts, except in experience, through which alone objects are given to us? We are able to know and characterize the possibility of things without any previous experience, but can do so merely with reference to those formal conditions under which anything at all is determined as an object in experience. And therefore we can do so entirely a priori for possibility, right? I can make, as long as it doesn't fail the law of non-contradiction, I can create possibilities in my head forever. But nevertheless, only in reference to experience and within its limits. Okay. The postulate concerning our knowledge of the actuality of things requires perception, true, and therefore sensation, of which we are conscious. It does not, indeed, require immediate perception of the object itself, the existence of which is to be known, yet it does require the connection between it and some actual perception, according to the analogies of experience, which expound all real connections in an experience in general. In the mere concept of a thing, no sign of its existence can ever be discovered. Right. Like thinking of something in your head and you have a concept of a triangle doesn't mean that you can use that to discover its existence. For although the concept be ever so complete, so that nothing should be wanting in it to enable us to think the thing with all its own determinations, existence has nothing to do with all this. Existence has only to do with the question whether such a thing be given to us, such that its perception can even precede its concept. Right, existence gives us certain things, to the point where like we often perceive things before we have a concept of them, and then we create the concept. It's not like everything, we have the concept first for everything, then we go about in the world experiencing it. But experience is kind of unique in that sense, like, whatever. A concept preceding the perception signifies its mere possibility, while perception, which supplies the material for the concept, is the sole mark of its actuality. Okay? It is possible, however, to know its existence even before the perception of a thing, and therefore comparatively a priori, right, provided it be bound up with some perceptions in accordance with the principles of their empirical connection, the analogies. Okay. For in that case, does this mean like drawing on past experience to like draw a conclusion about the existence of something else, even though you haven't actually experienced it? Like the house falling down, for example. For in that, the example of the house falling down is like you see a house that's like really rickety, and like based on your past experience of rickety houses, like in structural engineering and just like common sense, you know that it's going to fall down, even though you've never experienced an actual house like that falling down. For in that case, the existence of a thing is bound up with at least our perceptions in a possible experience, and guided by our analogies, we can start from our actual perception and arrive at the thing found in the series of possible perceptions. Thus we know the existence of a magnetic matter pervading all bodies from the perception of the attracted iron filings, even though our organs are so constituted as to render an immediate perception of the matter impossible. Interesting. According to the laws of sensibility and the context of our perceptions, we should in an experience arrive at an immediate empirical intuition of that magnetic matter, if only our senses were more acute. For their obtuseness does not concern the form of possible experience in general. Okay. Wherever, therefore, perception and its attachments reach according to empirical laws, there also reaches our knowledge of the existence of things. But if we do not begin with experience, or do not proceed according to the laws of empirical connection of appearances, We are only making a vain display in wanting to guess and explore the existence of anything. An important protest, however, against these rules for proving existence immediately is brought forward by idealism. And this is the proper place for its refutation. All right, page 238, the refutation of idealism. And I can't read anymore. I'm surprised. I was pretty close to just tapping out after the third analogy, but I'm glad I pushed through that because it was fairly straightforward. I think this is going to be kind of rough, though. Refutation of idealism. I've read Descartes and I've read Berkeley. Can't say I understood that. Maybe I understood it. Frankly, I don't remember much of Berkeley. I know like the big picture, but I don't remember taking in a lot when I was reading it. But anyway, we'll go there next. Refutation of idealism. I'm sure it'll be dope.